Welcome to the December author conversation for the 2019-2020 Marginal Syllabus. This project convenes and sustains equity conversations in the margins of text online using the digital annotation tool Hypothesis. I am Christopher Rogers from the Philadelphia Writing Project. In addition to being a graduate student in literacy at Penn GSE, I sit on the steering committee of the National Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action, and I will be your host for the conversation today. We got a terrific panel here to discuss this month's reading, which is titled Miles Morales, SpiderMan and Reimagining the Canon for Racial Justice. I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mario Worlds. I'm a doc student here at the University of Florida, and my area specialization is curriculum instruction with a specialization in literacy and language instruction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cody Miller. I'm in my first semester as an assistant professor of English education at the College of Rockport, which is part of the SUNY system. Prior to that, I was a high school English teacher and did my PhD at the University of Florida. So it went from hot Florida to cold New York.
Although it's a little cold here today.
Yeah, I heard yesterday I had a friend who said it was hoodie weather in Florida. Appreciate it. Oh, we also have a new guest on. Hey, Latrice, how you doing today? We were just getting started with introductions. Okay, we'll check in with Latrice in a second. Remy?
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Ramee Collier. I'm an assistant professor of learning technologies at the University of Colorado in Denver, and I'm also one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of the Marginal Syllabus.
Awesome. Hey, we got Latrice moving around for a second, getting settled in. So we'll get to her in a minute, allow her to do her introductions at a later part in the call. But for now, could, Cody and Mario, please, could you tell us a bit more about this piece? Any background that you feel is important? And also, one of the amazing parts about Marginal Syllabus is focusing on working from the margins to the center and bringing equity to those conversations. So I would love to hear you all speak of how this piece in particular speaks to that equity conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think from the beginning, so the article is based off of Miles Morales, SpiderMan. And so I think if we're thinking about or looking at the character, that this text focuses on, he's at the margin, right? So he's Afro-Latino. He's going to school in an environment where he's the minority. He doesn't share the same financial resources of the students that he's going to school with. So I think right off the bat, we're asked as readers to recognize these different margins that he exists as a character and think about what those mean in terms of his identity and who he is as a student and as a person. And it kind of, the text actually forces us to kind of contend with those identity things and how those different identities place him at different margins.
Yeah, and so when we were writing this piece, like Mario said, we were looking at, when we first read it, we were looking at Miles's experiences and how schools are often sites for racial violence. And so we thought about really identifying that in the text, like what is happening to Miles at school, what is happening with his teacher, Mr. Chamberlain, how is curriculum and teaching used to reinforce racial hierarchies. But then we kind of wanted to abstract out more than just how is this operating in the text, but how does this idea of racial violence in schools, how does it operate broadly within schools, not just in this text? So that got us to really think about looking at the canon as a tool for white supremacy, right? And canonical texts still make up the bulk of English textbooks, right, that are purchased for schools, and often have those narratives get perpetuated. And as we talk about in the piece, the canon often gets to have this kind of veil of objectivity, right? It kind of gets positioned as ta-da, these wonderful texts rain down from the heavens and were given to the people, right? And like, that's not true, right? We know that, like, the canon is a tool of the colonizer, and it represents knowledge that reflect power. So we really wanted to situate that the book and in that conversation as well. So, and then when we first read it, Mario and I often joked about, like, we want to read this and become SpiderMan scholars, and then we did, so that felt really good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited for the way we will also dig into the margins of this article and this project as we move forward, and maybe ourselves aspire to become Spider-Man scholars ourselves. And just to give us a little bit, to give us a little bit more about the Marginal Syllabus project, I want to pass it to Ramee.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Chris. And so, first of all, again, Mario, Cody, thank you so much for joining us as partner authors and for sharing this really important article with us. Let me just very briefly talk a little bit about the Marginal Syllabus as a project for people who are watching or listening and who are perhaps new to this initiative. We began in 2016, and over the last 4 years have grown into a partnership that is supported by the National Writing Project. The last 2 years now, we've been reading and writing about and commenting on and discussing texts that come from NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English Journals. And so they're now a partner with us in the current iteration of our syllabi. And we also are partnered with a nonprofit technology organization called Hypothesis that helps to enable our conversations using a free open source tool, again, that is called the Hypothesis tool. And that's where we have our conversations in an online space more asynchronously as a complement to this conversation on this webinar. And when some people hear about our project for the first time, they often ask, well, what is marginal about the Marginal Syllabus? And so I always want to emphasize 3 points. The first is that we're engaging with authors and with texts or scholarship that is marginal to dominant discourses about educational equity or schooling, maybe more generally. And so when we read Cody and Mario's piece about the canon as a tool of kind of colonial white supremacy inside of schools and the need to challenge that within the racial hierarchy, not only of schools, but of curricula and the design of the kinds of learning experiences that students have. This is very much a kind of marginal perspective on those particular issues. We also, as noted, have conversations in marginal online spaces. And so when we turn this conversation into its online version throughout the month of December in 2019, again, we'll be doing so in the margins of the article that Mario and Cody have written for us, and we'll see a conversation blossom there. And then lastly, we're engaging again with educators and teacher educators using a technology hypothesis that is very much marginal to the commercialization of educational technology. And so these are 3 of the ways in which we see marginal, the use of that term really coming to life in this project. The last thing I'll mention briefly is that because we are recording this conversation in and around the time of the NCTE annual conference, the Marginal Syllabus has kind of an anchor in that community and in that space now. And so if you are attending that conference or did attend that conference, please know that we are really supportive of and encouraged by all of the various people in those communities who are participating in this project as well. I'll leave it there. You can learn more about the project either following the hashtag Marginal Syllabus or by simply visiting our website along with all the other resources posted online. And I'm just eager to listen to the conversation today. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks again, Ramee. And before we go into the discussion today, Latrice, are you there with us to do a quick introduction? Okay, so she's still moving through the world. When she gets seated down, we'll make sure she gets introduced. My colleague, Latrice Ferguson, is amazing here at Penn. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right.
You walk around.
Yeah. So we're just doing like a quick introduction. We're about to head into our sort of like discussion.
Do you mind if I just come in here with you? Is there a class in here? No.
She's walking into our Penn GSC building.
Sorry.
Amazing space. You're perfectly well. So we were just getting around to introductions. I know we spoke already about this article and the Miles Morales story. I know you come out of the library world. So if you could just give us a quick introduction about the work that you do and what was exciting about this article for you.
Sure. So I'm Latrice Ferguson. I'm a first year PhD student with Chris in the Reading, Writing, and Literacy program at UPenn. I come from, so I worked in both a high school library and also Chicago Public Library as a children's librarian. And I studied, prior to coming here, I studied children's lit at Kansas State University. So yes, I was really excited to read this article and really think about the ways that the canon, even if we're talking about titles that feature people of color, how sometimes those things can create the sense that racism and things like that are in the past. So how can we begin to talk with students about the current manifestation of racism? And like I even think about things like Invisible Man and like the way that the language gets broken down without really talking about the like racism in the text, right? So like talking about like what a great American classic it is, but not really talking about how it's about race, which seems really crazy, but I think that comes up a lot as well. So yes, I'm really excited. I really enjoyed the article for sure. So.
Yes. Yeah. Cody or Mario, would you like to speak to that in ways that in which we can highlight the text as and by focusing on race and the histories of race, what you talk about in the text?
Yeah, so Latrice kind of hinted towards this idea, right, of like racism being something that is historical and not necessarily happening at this moment. And so I think what this text does is a really great job of centering race and kind of forcing us to have that discussion. First, just by the casting of an Afro-Latino Spider-Man, right? And so right off the bat, as consumers of superhero text and movies, right, we have to contend with the fact that this is now a Black imagining of who Spider-Man is. And so I think right off the bat, Reynolds is asking us, okay, so let's talk about it, because that in and of itself has sparked a lot of debate and a lot of discussions about race and racism, particularly in people's response into the casting of Spider-Man as a Black young boy. And so I think, again, in addition to all these other kind of secondary or tangential discussions of race, right, it places right at the forefront and makes us think about those things.
Yeah, so I think it was back in 2018, but it might have been 17. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas did a speech at Jolly, and she talked about race bending, and that was before The Dark Fantastic came out. And we took all of these notes on it, and then when we got Miles Morales, we were like, oh my God, like we have to like think about how this applies to this. And so yeah, Mario and I started looking up fans' reactions to when the comic book first came out, right? Because the comic book predates Reynolds' adaptation, and we saw this Whiteness is property around Spider-Man, right? And I think that it's telling that Whiteness is property is around a figure like Spider-Man, who is heavily associated with all of these like white American ideals, right? Like New York, the Statue of Liberty, freedom, et cetera, right? The first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire was kind of considered one of the first post 9/11 superhero movies, right? Because we have this superhero who sweeps in and saves us in New York City. And we were so interested in this figure who got so associated with this kind of white idea of America. Like, what happens when we race, when an author race bends? And so like Mario said, like by choosing to adapt Miles Morales as opposed to say Peter Parker, it is forefronting this conversation that we're going to be talking about race with this. And I also really liked your point, Latrice, around books that include racism but can get positioned in ways that they never talk about racism, right? Like you could do like, I'm thinking of like even the way the Common Core standards reinforce this, right? Like you could look at Invisible Man and it's like, we're going to analyze the structure and the language, right? Like you said, or we're going to do like a plot diagram, but we're never going to talk about like what the book is about. And it kind of reminds me, I think it was Joyce Carol Oates a few years ago, or maybe it was a few months ago. These days, months feels like years sometimes. But she said something that was like really ridiculous. It was something around like race has nothing to do with like Othello, which it's like, huh? Like what? Like, huh? And so this like inclination to this like this inclination among folks who see the canon as unsaleable, whenever we try to bring this racial analysis, even looking at those defenses, are similar defenses that people use to defend canonical superheroes, which of course Spider-Man is one.
Thanks. That this one of the people I just have to like lift up, as you brought up, our advisor, myself, Chris Rogers, and Latrice, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. So the reason we're both here at GSC is because of her work. So I'm sure that you like lifted up her work. That's amazing. It let you know like how small world it is. I think in this conversation, and I think this becomes an interesting point, just as if we talk about how people can sort of like teach around race or try not to avoid those particular situations. And it gets to me into thinking in particular, and we talk about this in children's literature, around what we ask of the text and what we ask of a teacher's pedagogy, right? And in terms, in some ways, do we expect more from a text and expect, and rather than the sort of like burden of a teacher to do the heavy lifting of, because in critical race theory sort of teaches us that race is present in everything, right? It's present everywhere. So in many ways, this sort of interplay between like, does the text give us an entryway to think about race versus the teacher, or the ways in which we can sort of like make race present within the conversation. So I'm interested in how you all thought about the interplay between like, what does the text bring, but what does a teacher's pedagogy have to bring into the conversation, in particular for like struggles around racial justice?
Yeah, and I like to think that the teacher's pedagogy has a lot to do with it, right? Because I feel like you can have any text and the issue of race can be, as some might argue, very present, very forefronted, whereas it could also be kind of like a secondary point within the story. But I think it's up to the teacher to kind of acknowledge that this is an opportunity to have these discussions, these conversations about race. Because even if we think about Spider-Man and Miles Morales, right? For us, given our background and our approach to literature and instruction, we see these things and, we make it a priority to address them. But on the same hand, you can have an instructor who reads it and say, okay, this is an interesting text about Spider-Man. Let's go ahead and talk about Spider-Man. And they could also, frame it as a discussion on, coming of age and overcoming, and a guy from an urban neighborhood and he's making it in a nice private school. And so I do think that a lot of it has to do with the pedagogy that the teacher brings to that text, and having the willingness to bring that forth within the discussions that you have with your students. Because a text, a lot of that depends largely on how we choose to interpret and how we choose to teach it. And so I think, while some texts, again, do more explicitly address race, I do think a lot of it is determined by how we as instructors and teachers choose to use that within our classrooms.
Yeah, and so I want to uplift the hashtag Disrupt Text movement. So that's a movement started by 4 really amazing teachers: Julia Torres, Lorana Herman, Tricia Barvia, and Kim Parker. Their work is super amazing, and they are definitely starting what I think is the most important movement in English language arts as a field. And they talk a lot about how do we, you can take like any text and kind of disrupt it and untangle it. And I think, thinking just of superheroes, if we look at the superhero canon, right, like asking, like, where are superheroes of color, right? Like, especially in, I love comic books and I feel bad I don't know the word for this, but like the difference between a comic like SpiderMan, where it's just like one hero, and like X-Men, where it's an ensemble of heroes, right? I'm sure there's a word that describes the difference between those two, but I'm not sure of it. But looking at how maybe when you have more ensemble pieces like X-Men, then yes, we do get some superheroes of color, but also even within those superheroes, who still gets centered, right? It's like Cyclops, it's Jean Grey, it's Wolverine, and all of their drama that goes on and on and on, and constantly kind of gets remade for the movies. Like asking who is there and who isn't, I think is a really important point. I think Tricia Barvia talked specifically about looking at the things they carried, and which is very much an imperialist narrative, right, around the Vietnam War, and simply asking students, like, where are the Vietnamese in this text, right? Like, do they get a say? Like, who gets talked about and who actually gets to speak? I think about when I taught, and students would read Lord of the Flies, and just simply asking, where are folks of color in this narrative, and where are women, including white women, right? Like they're nowhere to be seen. And that in and of itself tells us something about race and gender, even if the text doesn't explicitly say that.
Latrice, do you have any questions you would like at this moment? If not, I've always got something. Because I think one of the things that is also comes up for me when we talk about the canon and remaking the canon is sort of like the question of, well, should the canon exist, right? And it becomes sort of like this reductive way of, in some ways, reductive way of like, well, we're always going to hold a certain amount of books in esteem. So how are we? What makes up the canon? Are we always remaking the canon, or is there the possibility for an an anti-canon or something like that in the way that we move? And I would love to add in seeing that you all even like sort of develop its own sort of like canon or a resource list or syllabus towards a racial justice project. I would like to alongside Disrupt Text think about how you all go about developing a sort of like a collective approach to think like what should the canon be in today's time? Should a canon exist? How do you answer that question?
There was an NCTE chat not too long ago, and the topic was the Canon of Our Communities. And I really loved that framing of not a canon, but like multiple canons, right? Like, what are the canons we bring? How do we construct canons for our own individual lives? How do we construct those for our communities, for our families? And I think that is a really interesting way of thinking, like, what are the texts broadly defined, right, that we've engaged in that have created who we are. Like, that shaping of a definition of canon, I think, is far more equitable and liberatory than a definition of a canon that says this is the knowledge that if you have this, right, then you're a well-learned individual, or whatever, all the language that's used to talk about, all the language that gets used to reinforce the canon, right? So I love that you said anti-canon. I like that. Like, in the age of anti-heroes, I like the anti-canon. That's really fun. So I think if we could like reshape the canon as like texts that make me who I am versus texts that like you have to know to be someone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's, oh, go ahead, Latrice.
No, go ahead. I can wait.
No, I was just going to say, to Cody's point, it actually reminds me of a conversation that he and I had about the canon as we were writing this piece. And I think we both agree that there are a lot of texts within the canon that we actually enjoy, and that, we enjoyed as kids. And so it's not necessarily that it's inherently a bad thing, so to speak, is so much as not making it wide enough or inclusive enough to include different perspectives and different experiences. And I think that is where the major problem comes in with the canon as it currently exists. and the more reasoning for, as Cody stated, to kind of broaden that to include more communities and more perspectives and experiences.
I think like what I was gonna say is, so I think this is an odd comparison, but I think about the way people talk about the canon and the way people talk about intersectionality. So like when people say to themselves, like my identity is intersectional, like I'm a Black woman who, you know, or like they note off all of the pieces of their identity and say that I'm intersectional. I think about the way we think about the canon in that way as well. So like intersectionality is about not just your personal identity, but the way that structures and institutions impact you due to the way that you are, the ways that people are marginalized in different ways. And so I think about the canon in the same way, in that like we should be thinking about the canon as what are the texts that influenced your individual identity. But I think what happens is that the way that institutions require certain texts, like the way that they promote certain texts, canonizes them, right? So how and those institutions are influenced by racism and sexism and classism and all of those things. So I think that we have to intercept those moments when like teachers in school say, oh, we're going to require these texts, or we have to, like I know in library sciences, a really huge thing is the ALA Youth Media Awards. And so like those books are often, they get like for like, cause all the libraries buy them, a lot of schools buy them and add them to their collection. And they immediately are in print long-term, like for that reason, because they get that medal. And so what are the titles that continue to get purchased, and how do they promote specific people, right? Like the fact that there are more books that feature rabbits than feature like children of color. And so like how do those institutions create the canon, and how can we disrupt those moments rather than like, because I do think it's important to think about the titles that we collectively, like that shaped us, because I think that's significant. And then we then go out and share those things, and create our pedagogy around the titles that we appreciate and find value in. But I also think that we have to interrupt those, like the classics and those kinds of things that continue to be like, why are we still teaching To Kill a Mockingbird? I feel like there are other things that are like, that can do the same work as well. And so I think that how can we interrupt those moments? How can we get on those like ALA Youth Media Awards committees to like really promote titles that, you know, that don't feature rabbits or trucks? so yeah.
Can I say, if I really hope that you write the paper where you talk about intersectionality, how it gets used in the canon, because I would read it over and over and over. So I hope you're writing that, because I want to read
it. Yeah, maybe one day. You should write it with me. We can talk about it.
I like that. Throw in some more Spider-Man. Well, you can join us in our Spider-Man scholar. Yeah, Spider-Man scholarship.
Yeah, well, I guess it's like isn't Spider-Man like, is it Justice League or something? I'm sorry, I'm messing up things. Avengers, he's Avengers, right? So maybe it's called the Avengers Scholarship. Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, Academic Avengers. There you go. We get the I like it.
Right.
No, I like it.
Yes. One of the things I want to touch upon as well is the transition from the sort of like text, so the pedagogy of understanding the histories of racism, into you position the work as racial justice, which involves, you know, action. And, you know, in particular to my experience, part of the things that we lift up, the resources like this, is part of the sort of like Black Lives Matter Week School of Action, which happens in February. And we sort of try to promote strategies for teachers and communities to bond together about how to pursue racial justice in schools. And in this paper, you kind of give particular insights around sort of like particular movements that you think this text does a great job of lifting up in terms of like actionable strategies and community organizing that can happen around particular policies, whether they be in schools or in communities. And I want to have a moment to talk about that work of transitioning from like a sort of like this textual discussion into conversations about ongoing organizing and how you all sort of see that play, you know, in the classroom, but also beyond the classroom, and how can teachers be able to sort of like lift that up?
So one thing that I would really like to position this text with, and then kind of around broader movements in action, is the movement to elect more progressive district attorneys. And I believe Philadelphia has been leading in that movement. And we just saw last week, I believe in San Francisco. So the movement to use democratic participation to think about who gets to be sitting at the table for power and who gets to make decisions. And now democratic participation obviously is a flawed strategy for lots of reasons, right? There's all sorts of structures that deny people democratic participation. But I think I would really love to have students think about, like, we've identified this problem within a text, we've studied it, as you said, moving from textual discussions into action. So what can we learn about something as seemingly simple as who is our district attorney and what do they stand for, right? Because I think oftentimes both adults and K-12 students, I think when we think of the political discourse and politics broadly, we think of things like the presidency and Congress, which are obviously important, right? But a lot of the movements around really shifting the criminal justice system and making big changes happens in those DA seats. And I'm really heartened that those races have gotten a lot more attention in the media. But I'm no scholar on DA races in the media, but it feels like lately it's been much more in the news than I remember growing up. So that's something I would definitely want to connect this text with, is like, how can you get involved in these elections? Even if you can't vote, how can you do things like knock on doors? How can you get people engaged? How can you have these conversations? Of course, I also think we should lower the voting age to 16, but that's a whole other different conversation.
I think for me, one of the areas that I like to see this text kind of help further in terms of existing movements is this overall critique of disciplinary practices that we see in school, and how often these lead to disproportionate suspension rates, which kind of further creates this pipeline for the school to prison pipeline. And I think this text is a really, really great way to do that. And also, one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been thinking about this text is, also giving voices to students within classrooms and allowing them the autonomy to feel free enough to speak their experiences and speak their opinions on different things, particularly those things that are impacting them personally. And so when I think about, for example, Miles' hesitation to respond to Mr. Chamberlain when he makes certain comments, as well as, Alicia's punishment for speaking out and speaking the truth. And so I think this text has the ability to partner really well with student activism, particularly as it relates to student activism within schools, and kind of connecting those things as it relates to their educational experiences, their own educational experiences.
Yeah.
I'll jump in briefly. I'm just enjoying listening to everyone's contributions, and I really appreciate how this conversation echoes, in some respects, something that we're discussing in the current marginal syllabus conversation online. So again, for people who are watching or listening, we're recording this webinar as a complement to our December conversation. And currently, in the month of November, we're discussing an article by Samuel J. Tanner about whiteness in English teacher education, English education. And there's a real inflection point in that article about moving from awareness of white privilege to really kind of practical anti-racist work. And it reminds me that, again, the article that Mario, you and Cody, you have written for us and that we're discussing now, again, really articulates the shift from not only recognizing, critiquing the canon as a tool of white supremacy, but then again, moving us in a concrete way towards strategies for racial justice in that practice of literacy education. And Latrice, I just really loved your example of saying, there are these awards committees. That's kind of this like formal sanctioning of what is in, of what counts, of what is esteemed. And if we are to disrupt texts, not only in the work of that particular project, but more broadly, that is of course one very critical way. And Mario, again, your focus on the school to prison pipeline, and not only in the article, but in your comments here that are kind of reminding us of restorative justice work is really important. And I just really think that these kinds of shifts towards doing the work of racial justice in this way is very important. I'd also just love to throw out there, as we kind of lift up other authors and lift up other resources, Mario, your last point about really having students speak to their own experiences and get involved in their own kind of justice-oriented work reminds me of an article that we read in last year's Marginal Syllabus. We've read quite a few articles over the years about student activism in a variety of ways, but I'll specifically mention the article that was titled, "We Are Not Dirt, Frarian Counter-Narratives and Rhetorical Literacies for Student Voice in Schooling." It was co-authored by Everardo Pedraza and R. Joseph Rodriguez, and I think it just provides another really lovely perspective in its own critical and challenging and important ways towards, again, making a shift towards an awareness of systemic injustice, towards very practical pedagogical moves that support student agency in being those who do get to speak and do get to make policy change, in this case, the focus of their own school and in the structural policies of disciplinary practices in their own school. So if people are interested, you can easily find that article as part of our Marginal Syllabus from last year's discussions.
And oh, go ahead, Cody.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think that, especially in thinking about whiteness and teacher education and the Tanner article, one thing that I also think is so powerful about Reynolds' narrative is that I think it really challenges a narrative that white liberals in this country convince themselves is real, and that is the South is uniquely racist and the North is like the utopia of racial progress, right? And I think that narrative drives the popularity of To Kill a Mockingbird, right? That it happens in the South, like here's this racism. I think what makes Reynolds' narrative so important is that he locates the school to prison pipeline in New York City, right? Like in a northern state in New York City. And he ties that specifically to Mr. Chamberlain, who's a Confederate zombie, which is also how I describe Jeff Sessions. But it also works for him too. And I think it does a really good job bringing that narrative of that white liberals perpetuate, right? Of South bad, North good, to the forefront and challenging it. So.
Yeah,
I
and
was
I think.
thinking. Okay.
Cool. No, and I was going to say, Cody, that reminded me of, I think, one of Latrice's earlier points in terms of importance of using other texts other than texts within the canon, just because a lot of them do force you to think about racism, not only within a contemporary context, but also geographically speaking, right? Because there is that assumption that racism is a Southern thing. But like you said, by placing the setting within New York City, which everyone thinks of this liberal dystopia where everything is all great and there's all racial harmony and everyone gets along, right? So it kind of forces you to question and challenge that notion and think about racism as a global concept, which it is a global concept.
Yeah, well, there's two specific things that I want to lift up in terms of the connections that we make. And I thank you, Cody, for lifting up the work that has been happening in Philadelphia around really pushing our elected officials to be more progressive and taking a stance against the sort of like prison industrial complex. And one of the ways in which we've been a national leader in that is also with the Philadelphia Student Union. So the Philadelphia Student Union is a youth organizing group, works with high school students across the city of Philadelphia. And recently they worked with the Advancement Project on a national level report and activity guide that is amazing, called We Came to Learn. And We Came to Learn um, is a history of looking at the role of police in schools. I mean, sometimes they're named as school resource officers, but they are indeed police. And the role of the investment in police officers in schools versus the disinvestment from counselors, nurses, and other sort of like public health center initiatives in schools to really support student and family growth. So the work that they have done to create this report, which talks about that history, but also this activity guide and action book that can be used in classrooms to dig into this history and look at, I think, Mario, you mentioned around disproportionate discipline rates in schools. So how do young people gain access to that information? How do they sort of like use that actionable data and kind of get into like a whole project-based approach, right? Interdisciplinary project-based approach, which is looking at this data and making recommendations, almost leading into like a youth participatory action research project. So the work of the Philadelphia Student Union, and the movement for, hashtag police free schools, or you can look up the hashtag We Came to Learn and find that report and activity guide. It's something that we highlight as part of the national Black Lives Matter Week of Action. And definitely this seems, your resources that you pull up in this article seems also like a great addition to that. And I think as we're also mentioning the work of Jason Reynolds, who is, I don't know how he keeps up his pace. But Jason Reynolds, is I think one of the things I'm really excited about this NCTE that's coming up is his work along with Ibram Kendi, who just finished a bestseller called How to Be an Anti-Racist. It will be coming out in YA form in 2020. And I think about that resource in connection with the Miles Morales work as a way to build that transition into action. And I know Ibram Kendi work tried to say anti-racism is a verb, and the work that must continue. So I just, in thinking of like resources and connections, I'm someone who always is sort of like linking things, and those two things definitely came up to me. But I also want to give opportunity, Latrice, when you came into this article and you think about the movements that it sort of like quotes and lifts up, were there connections that you were making in terms of how teachers or students could, transition from the work of Miles and Morales and SpiderMan to think about on their participation in ongoing anti-racist movements?
I think the ones that came to mind are the ones that we've kind of talked about. So thinking about like the teachers and educators who are promoting their work on like Twitter and Instagram for sure. One thing that I always remember when I think about like books like this and how we can promote them is I went to a conference and Christopher Myers, who is a children's book illustrator, he talks about like the not just the need for diverse text, but also like the need for like to promote like experience, like not just like texts that talk about the precarious nature of being a person of color in America, but also those that just promote like the everyday experiences of what it's like to be a child of color, doing activist work, doing things in their communities, like their communities from like the perspective not of like precarity or like harm, like the and especially like we were talking about this earlier, like not the historical perspective, like the books that get published that feature people of color are often like set in historical context. So thinking about like contemporary and even mundane experiences that could be like useful in terms of we need diverse books. So thinking about people's experiences not as other, but like as also more than just like precarity, I guess. And so yeah, so I think about that too. So how can we start to think of we need diverse books and other, you know, diverse stories and own voices in relation to like having more stories be out there so that we don't have to depend so much on like histories. Because I think Miles Morales does that. Like it's a story that he's a superhero, but it does like touch on like the school to prison pipeline and like all of these issues that are significant and important. But it's also, you know, about Miles's like his experience as a kid in New York City that is not necessarily like precarious all the time, right? Like like, you know, so I think that there's something to be said about those stories as well, and especially placing him in a context that we always think of as white. So how can we place more people of color in contexts that we always assume are white? Like there can be like Black superheroes. It doesn't have to be Peter Parker. And so I think that that's significant. And I think there have been quite a few like Marvel, like race band ones. So like Miss Marvel is one of them as well. And so, yeah, so like having more inclusive stories of the, you know, of the everyday, as opposed to like histories or, you know, ones that center like the precarious nature of being a child of color. So for sure.
Yeah, like we get to see Miles's friendship with Genki, right? Like that's a big driver in the story. In addition to like everything that's happening is like, here's this friendship I have, and here's how this impacts me on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think that's important, especially because when we think about the racial hierarchy that kind of goes into what is considered the canon, and that largely determines what type of text, even from those marginalized communities, get selected. I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, Black pain is in a lot of ways very marketable. And so that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of these narratives, if any at all. It's a lot of the ones that focus on Black pain that tends to get centered and applauded versus, like you mentioned, Latrice, those works that speak to just everyday experiences that reaffirm Black humanity outside of violence that we experience as a result of racism.
This, and thank you for that, Latrice, because it reminds me of a story. I used to be a school librarian for a pre-K through 8 school, and it was at the time that it was March Volume 2, the John Lewis work around the graphic novel series, and we had just got in. I was so excited about it, and looking to find some of the school is, you know, predominantly white. We had a number of Black students, and I was like, I want to make sure I get this book in the hands of, you know, some Black students to read it. And when I was sort of like making my pitch as a librarian for why they should read this book, the response from this 5th grader was like, I want to read like fantasy. I'm tired of like you. They always give me a book that has to have like a lesson in it, and I gotta learn about my history. And it's like, I want to just read like a fantasy story. Give me something where it's just like, and it to me it talked about. I mean, it challenged me to think about the ways in which, like you say, like almost like the ever-present white gaze, in terms of even the books that we would center Black life was in many ways sort of like trying to instrumentalize an approach to the world that we deem just, not something where we sort of like reveled in the agency of the reader or just something that was fit to their experience, but in many ways was trying to be like this um, a resistance narrative when many folks were just seeing something. I just want to read something that's pleasurable, right? To me, and I think about that in particular around like how we present racial justice, and the work of that, right? And as much as we sort of try to fight against the tide of this is the work of all of us, and this is the work that we all must be involved in many ways, the sort of connotation that comes up is that, oh, this is a book for the Black students. This is a book for people who represent a particular identity. And I would love to hear from you all on like how do you challenge that work, and how do you um, in many ways sort of like, yes, find the space to honor and affirm, readers, but also say that this is something that we all should be involved in, and the sort of like challenge or um, conflicts that comes up with that.
So I think that, to kind of go back to the text for a second, I think that one thing that both in Reynolds' adaptation in the comic and also in the highly successful Into the Spider-Verse, which is the best Marvel film, I think the best thing Marvel's ever done. And I think that we really, and I want to say too, Mario and I, we wrote this before that movie came out, and I feel like it came out and it was like, oh, well, that was like really, like that worked out really nicely for us, how that worked. But I think that both in those texts, Miles is you get to see Miles' experience like and he's such a fully realized character and such a full you get to see all of his emotions, right? You get to see everything he goes through, and you get to see how the height of fighting a villain, right, has the same kind of height and adrenaline as like trying to get a date, right? And like I think that that's what's so that kind of unabashed love of being a teenager, I think, is really shines in that text. And then for your question about getting us to think about how this is everyone's work, I really love how in the end of the book, throughout the book, Miles is kind of fighting this kind of mysterious villain, and Genki is certainly involved, right? He's kind of like Miles' sounding board. But then towards the text, we get to see a broader youth movement where there's like a walkout and like all the students, right? It's time for like all of us to do it, because we've now all recognized not just this curricular injustice that's been done to us by a teacher who perpetuates the lost cause myth, but also by a school system that constantly harms students of color. And we kind of know that Brooklyn Heights Academy, Miles says that like he is very much an outsider because of his class and race. And in the text, we see students who have different racial and class identities stand in solidarity with Miles to stand up to this. So I think that as kind of a mentor text for what the kind of solidarity work where we're all together fighting this could look like.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, to echo off your point, Cody, as well as Chris, that I think one of the beautiful things about this text in the development of Miles is that we do get to see him as a full character. So it's not just his interactions or engagement with, racism or his teacher, Mr. Chamberlain, but he's also existing as, like you say, a normal teenage boy. Like he has his crushes, he has his friendship with Genki, as well as, his familiar issues with his uncle, and then he has his relationship with his mom and dad. And I think that in and of itself, to connect back to a point you made earlier, Chris, I think that in and of itself is a form of racial justice. The act of just living, especially just living and just being in an environment that's always oppressive and always marginalizing. So just being able to live and survive, I think that's a radical form of racial justice that we can look towards.
That is I love the way you said that, and it's a very strong point for us to begin to wrap up this conversation as we move into a month-long conversation that will happen through the Marginal Syllabus tool. So I want to just ask folks, what are their final takeaways or enduring questions that you think can kind of guide our continued sort of like interrogation through this article and the work that it lifts up?
I'll jump right in because I have again I'm kind of holding two conversations in my head as I really listen to this conversation, I should say. Again, thinking a lot about the current marginal syllabus discourse online around white educators primarily discussing how they themselves understand, make sense of, and work against their own whiteness in a teaching and learning context, whether that's in a teacher education context or in a K-12 classroom. But the need to very clearly, again, articulate these entry points into anti-racist work. And I feel as though both Mario, you and Cody provide us with a really, again, really generative entry point. You know, you talk a lot about the need to push against literary hierarchies. And as you say in the conclusion to your article, that place whiteness as aspirational. And so as I leave this conversation and I leave the reading of your text, I hope that educators who are watching or listening might kind of use that as a way of asking themselves a question. The question perhaps being, how in my classrooms or the classrooms that I share with students, you know, how does my pedagogy push against literary hierarchies that places whiteness as aspirational? How is my pedagogy working to disrupt those racial injustices and that sense of white supremacy? How is my pedagogy being that disruptive force for racial justice as the canon is either reimagined or entirely perhaps dismantled? So again, just thank you for provoking those questions for me, and I hope for other educators who engage with your text, engage with, of course, Reynolds' book, and engage also with our conversation.
And I'll throw it to Latrice, and we'll give the authors the last word.
I think for me, like there's a lot to take away, but I really appreciated the conversation about the canon as well, and thinking about how, rethinking like the ways that we can disrupt the canon, or like how we see it, right? Like we have more, I feel like in the spaces that we occupy, we have more power than we probably think we do to create change, right? So I think it just requires like action, right? So I feel like I know that there are a ton of texts beyond To Kill a Mockingbird, but I feel like in the educational spaces that I was in before I came here, I don't think that I felt like I had the voice to say, why are you teaching this, right? Or to ask that question. So I think really pushing for that, and then also really pushing to be a part of those awards committees and things like that. And also like the conversation about disrupting text. So how can we begin to talk about text in ways that create fruitful conversations for youth, you know, in the different schools that we are in. So how can we engage them rather than just the banking method of education? So how can we go beyond talking about the language of Invisible Man and really talk about like the substance, and how can we, even if we are reading Invisible Man, which is a text that is located in the past, how can we begin to make connections to the present and with the students and their current lived experiences? So I think that those are things that I'm thinking about of how I can better incorporate that into my pedagogy, and also recognize my own agency in these situations as well. And like, and lastly, I think the tail end of the conversation about like joy, right? Like, like where, like I think joy can be radical as well. So actually pursuing joy and happiness in like the mundane and the regular lived experiences of people of color, to celebrate, to work against like the trauma and the pain and activism in that way, but to also, find joy and happiness within our own lived experiences as well too. So.
Thank you. We do have, like, I love that phrase. We have more power than we think. And when I think about the work of that Disrupt Text, and we kind of lifted up that movement is doing, and you all sort of motioned to them in the text as well as a place to sort of like gather. But I want to throw the final words to you all, Cody and Mario. What are your takeaways and what are questions you continue to wrestle with?
So I think for me, the takeaway is that one, there's still a lot of work to do. And then also, how do I engage with different stakeholders to make the actionable work actually, possible, particularly within the classrooms? Just thinking about some of the conversations that I've had with other friends who are teachers and who are currently in classrooms right now, a lot of the struggles are, the ability and approval to actually teach these texts in their own classrooms. And so thinking about how we can be champions within these different stakeholder conversations, whether that be with principals, school districts. Latrice, you mentioned your history as a librarian and getting these texts available in libraries across different counties, across different neighborhoods, just so that they can actually have access to these to even begin having these conversations. And so that's something that I've been thinking about recently is how can I be a champion and a partner in getting this available? And then also thinking about, how can I, as someone who works for pre-service teachers, prepare them enough so that they feel comfortable and feel strong enough to go into their classrooms and enact these type of changes within the work that they do as teachers themselves.
Yeah, so definitely thinking about Latrice's point about how we have more power than we often give ourselves credit as educators, and thinking about how Miles is a student in the text, and yet him and other students are the ones who stand up to this injustice in schools, and where are the teachers there, right? So if we're reaching points where students are actively working to change schools, like what roles can teachers have to amplify those students and work alongside them? And that way the teacher isn't absent, because it is true that in this case, one teacher was a problem. But he's not the only teacher, right, at Brooklyn Visions. What about, Miss Taylor, she's awesome and doing work, but like, what about all the other teachers? What about the principal? What about all these other folks in the school? Where are they? So that's my first takeaway. My second is thinking about being a white teacher educator in spaces. We know that, the majority of teachers in this country are white, and how I can work with white teacher candidates to think around the way that white educators and white teachers can cling onto these textual artifacts, right, and not critically examine why they're clinging so hard. So I think, it's something Mario and I have talked about a lot, that the stranglehold that white teachers want to hold around canonical texts comes from the same ideology of the white comic book fans who only want Spider-Man to be white Peter Parker, right? And it's the same mentality, and how to continually get white educators to critically reflect, like, why am I holding on so tight? Like, why am I putting all of my energy into holding on to this? So that's my second. The third takeaway is I am so happy that our Spider-Man scholars became the academic Avengers. So thank you for giving us that what is it? Avengers Assemble, academic Avengers Assemble. So thank you for that.
The Disney Corporation is going to kill us for that. They're going to. All right. Well, as we close, thank you to our viewers for joining Literacy, Equity, and Remarkable Notes today. Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and Reimagining the Canon for Racial Justice is online and accessible for participant annotations at educatorinnovator.org. For updates, subscribe to our blog and sign up to our monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. And follow us at innovates_ed and use the hashtag marginal syllabus. Oh my God, I'm gonna get that right. I'm putting the B in there like it's margarine or something. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to being in conversation with you soon.